All right, welcome back. Today we are jumping into filled pastas. To go with the filled pasta today, we're making ravioli, and I want to share with you my recipe for red sauce. Marinara, Sunday gravy, whatever you call it. This is one of my favorite things from childhood. We made this almost every Sunday, and I want to share that recipe with you all here. I have all of my ingredients, my onions, dried herbs, garlic, olive oil, canned tomatoes, and then I have some salt, sugar, pepper. We'll adjust seasoning as we're cooking and tasting. All right, so as we get started here, the first thing I want to do is start heating up my olive oil. This seems like a lot of olive oil. Just bear with me here. Fat is flavor, and that's one of the secrets to this recipe here. There's no fat in tomatoes or any of the other ingredients we're adding into this, so we really want to carry that flavor through the whole dish, and that's going to be the base that we're building everything else upon. I use nice olive oil here in this case, nothing crazy expensive, but you definitely just don't want to use like vegetable oil or canola oil because you'll get that taste in the final marinara. So first thing I'm going to do here is take my onion and we're just going to slice it. I'm going to take off both ends and then right in half. All right, so I have my two halves of the onion. I'm just going to peel off that outer layer. And then here for slicing the onions, we actually want to slice them thick because we're going to just get the flavor of the onion in there. They don't need to be super thin. And I actually like to cut this direction across the onion, not the direction that the stem and the root was on. So thin slices, using my fingers curled back, my thumb tucked underneath. And then once I'm about halfway done, I always like to turn the onion, and then I'm working on a flatter, more stable side. And the same thing with the other half. And you'll see here why I'm going for thick slices versus super thin julienne. So now I'm going to take my onions and add them to my oil I've been heating up. This is over medium-high heat. And we're actually looking to fry these in the oil till they're golden brown. I'm gonna get these into my oil that I've been preheating, and we're going for about 300, 320 degrees here on the oil, and we're actually trying to caramelize these onions. We're essentially frying them, shallow frying them in that fat. So now I also have my peeled garlic cloves. I'm gonna get that into the oil as well with the onions. And while these onions and garlic are frying in there, that's kind of like the secret to the Sasso family red sauce, is we're infusing that olive oil with all of the onion flavor, all of that garlic flavor. And we're just kind of swirling these around, and this will take anywhere from like 5 to 10 minutes. You just kind of want to watch it hang out. Before you know it, your entire house is going to smell delicious. All right, so our onions here are golden brown. What's important to look for here is that nothing is burnt, nothing is dark brown or black. If you get that dark brown, burnt color, you're going to have a bitter taste in your final sauce. I'm straining off the oil here and just setting these aside on a plate. So my onions here are golden brown. I'm straining them out with a small spider and setting all of them on the side here on this plate. These make great toppings for sandwiches or toast. We could also add them back into our sauce later, depending on how much you like onions and garlic. I sometimes snack on these during the day while I'm cooking, and then I'll add half of them back to the pan. My household growing up, that's how it worked, so that's how it still happens today. And then I have my seasoned oil here now. If you wanted to not make this vegetarian and you had meatballs, you had pork sausages, you had thick chicken thighs, this would be the time you'd want to sear those, get some nice and brown caramelized edges in that same oil before we added in our tomatoes. All right, so the next step here, we're gonna add our tomatoes to our oil to get everything all simmering together. I'm using whole peeled canned tomatoes here. You can use crushed tomatoes, and I'm actually using this kitchen tool here. This is called a food mill. A ricer, also goes by other names. It has all of these holes here on the bottom and then a blade on the inside that when you turn, it pushes the vegetables through the holes, essentially grinding them to the same texture and size. You can crush your tomatoes by hand. You can do it in a blender, just don't do it on high speed. You want it to have a little bit of texture and chunkiness. If you rip it really high on high speed, it'll kind of create this emulsification. You'll incorporate air into the tomatoes and you'll end up with an orange tomato sauce instead of a red tomato sauce. And I think everybody likes the red. So I'm just gonna go right into the oil. And turning my food mill, clearing the blade every couple of turns. You can do this in a food processor, works just as well. Or like I said, rust it by hand. It just kind of depends how I'm feeling. This is what I want today. And you can really use this recipe and technique and make it your own. All right, last but not least, this was always super important in my house growing up. Still use it today in the restaurants. Is taking a little bit of water and rinsing out the inside of your tomato cans. You'd really be surprised how much extra tomato you get in there. And that's just gonna go right in there. And since we're cooking our tomato sauce or marinara down over the stove, all that extra water we just added is going to end up actually evaporating, and we'll still concentrate all that tomato flavor back into our sauce. So I have the last of my tomatoes through the mill. Using a little spoon or spatula, don't forget and miss all these tomato bits down on the bottom. And then I'm gonna just bring this back to the heat, and we're gonna let it simmer uncovered for about 30 minutes at the minimum. 2 hours is even better, but it really, those flavors will start to develop. You don't wanna skim off any of that oil. That fat cap on there is gonna infuse the tomatoes with all that onion and garlic flavor. And then before we leave it on the stove, I'm gonna add all of my dry spices. I have dried oregano and dried thyme. I'm gonna taste this and season it with a little bit of salt, adjust it with sugar. Every variety of canned tomatoes is a little different. Some are a little sweeter, some are a little more acidic. Depending on how you like your marinara, you may wanna add a little more sugar or a little less sugar. If you like it spicy, this is the time to now add some Calabrian chilies or chili flakes. You really have a blank canvas to really spice this up. So now there, I'm seasoning, a little bit of salt, a tiny bit of sugar, just to balance everything out. I'm gonna add my dried herbs, some dried thyme and oregano, and then I like onions and garlic. So I'm gonna add about half of these and save the other half for toast. We're gonna let this simmer uncovered. I like to do it uncovered, so any water and condensation that would normally get trapped on the lid will instead evaporate, and we're concentrating all of that tomato flavor. All right, time to talk pasta dough. We're gonna make some raviolis. Raviolis are essentially just any envelope of filled pasta using our ricotta filling and our egg yolk dough. One of the keys to successful pasta making is proper preparedness. I always have everything set in place before I start working with my dough. I give myself plenty of room and I make sure any unnecessary things are out of the way. It helps keep things clean, neat, and organized. So I like to keep a separate bowl or a little bin here. This is for my waste, any little trim pieces, or kind of think of it as a little trash can so you don't have to run back and forth through the trash and you're not just piling up extra pieces of dough. I like to keep another bin of bench flour. This is just my regular 00 flour. I'm gonna use this for dusting throughout the process. I always keep a couple of zip top bags. The ones with the zipper I find are best, and I'll show you why I like to use these. Having a knife around is very helpful for making cuts on the pasta, but also opening bags to get everything out. I like to keep a kitchen towel around just to kind of help wipe your hands or any additional dust that may happen. And then I'm using here a double-sided pasta cutter. One end is fluted, one end is straight. If you don't have one of these, you can use a fork to make these same impressions. You use a pizza roller, or you could just use a knife. All right, so I have my dough ball here and my dough sheeter. If you don't have a pasta sheeter, or if it's one of those hand crank models, that works just as well. Or the KitchenAid attachment, I find works really, really well. Or if you don't have any of those, this can be done with a rolling pin or wine bottle. I'm gonna save half of this to show you that process, but we'll start first with our sheeter. So what I want to do though is flatten my dough down, keeping everything nice and even. This dough has been tempered, which means it is room temperature. I've left it out for about an hour or two. It's nice and soft and easy to work with. The last thing you want to do is try to roll hard, cold, stiff pasta dough. And part of this is I'm just pre-shaping it now here. So trying to get a nice even rectangle, so that way when I feed it into the machine, I don't have any odd snaked edges or ends. And then I have a rolling pin. So my rolling pin here is just going to bring it down to the size of my machine. Every machine is going to vary, and that kind of thickest setting is going to be where you want to start, how thin you need to get it with your rolling pin. Never try to force your dough into the machine. You'll stress things out, it'll start to tear and split, and it'll just make a big mess. You always want to make sure this is as thin as your machine will take it. All right, so before we get started, I'm gonna stick my other half of dough into my plastic zip top bag. This is gonna keep it sealed and away from the air. Air is not your friend. It dries out the dough, it makes it harder to work with. You always wanna only work with as little bit as possible, keeping it not exposed to the outside air. I have this opened to as wide as it goes, and I have my dough rolled out to as thin as this opening. I'm gonna switch on my machine and just start feeding my dough in. I'm going through each setting one time, and I'm going each setting one at a time. I'm not jumping down more than one number, always starting at the widest and never skipping a number. If I were to skip a number, I'll be stressing the dough out. Nobody wants to stress out their dough. And then as I'm guiding the dough into the machine, I'm using this backhand to kind of create a little bit of pressure, and I'm not just letting it fall into the machine at any pace, because then I'm able to guide it. If you only had a hand crank, you would have your hand crank right here, and you'd be cranking it into the machine and then pulling out the other half of the dough. And I'm going to take this down about halfway. So I have 10 numbers here, and I'm going to go all the way down to number 5. That's halfway on my machine. Every time it's coming out, I'm putting the opposite end in first. So that way, all of that pressure is getting evenly applied to my mass of dough, and it's not all going the same direction every time. As I'm working with the dough, I'm using the backs of my hands to pick it up. If I were to use my fingertips, there's a chance that I may start puncturing the dough, especially when it starts to get thin and delicate. And by only using the backs of my hands without any jewelry, watches, bracelets, anything like that is going to get in the way. And that way I'm able to kind of handle my dough, work with it back and forth. If you notice that it's humid where you are and things are getting sticky, that's what your bench flour is for. Dusting, using the flour to kind of come off your hand versus sprinkling. Sprinkling has a tendency to leave chunks of flour, and you really don't need a lot. It's a very minimal little dust of flour will kind of help lubricate everything so nothing sticks. All right, so my dough is halfway mark here. I have 10 settings. I brought it down to number 5. And now I want to laminate the dough. We worked some air into the dough. You can see there are all these little bubbles on the surface, and that's a good thing. All those bubbles means there's layers of air in there, and that's going to give us some extra texture. But there are some striations in the dough from our initial kneading. Everything's not as smooth as possible, so I always like to do at least one lamination. And by lamination, I mean by folding the sheet over itself, bringing it back to a nice square, and then I'm going to put this back into my machine. But keep in mind, if this now has made it too thick than your thickest setting, you're going to want to start with the rolling pin, so we're not forcing the dough into the machine or getting it too thick for it to start. What else this is doing is aligning all of those glutens. So we've worked the dough, we've strengthened the gluten, there's plenty of it there, but by laminating and sheeting over itself, we're kind of getting everything in one long line and chain. So we're going to be able to roll this into one long sheet without any tears or breakage. So now I'm going back to the wide setting. I'm turning my dough to the length of the machine, so I have the same width going across. And I'm just gonna feed it in here. And the same thing as before, using my backhand to kind of hold the dough back so it's not just falling into the machine, otherwise it may have a tendency to bunch up. Using the backs and undersides of my hands and pulling the sheeted dough out from the bottom end and rotating. So whatever was the first side in then becomes the other side. Moving one number at a time and starting to take my dough out. If you notice your edges are cracking or things are really dry, you could spray a little water on top of your dough and kind of rub it in. Let that hydrate a bit. But because of where I'm at, I know my temperature, I know my environment, and you'll learn yours the more pasta that you make. And I'm actually then going to take this down to number 4. So that's about 4 settings from the thinnest. And this is going to be my stopping point. I normally take all my doughs to here. It's laminated, it's ready to roll. I could continue to take this all the way down to the size I want it for my ravioli, but then I would end up with this giant piece of dough and I have no room to put it, and it would start to dry out and everything would go to waste. Instead, what I'm going to do is cut this into workable strands. And by doing this, I can keep each of these pieces of dough dusted with flour, stacked neatly, and in my bag away from air. Now I have all these pieces of dough ready to go, and I can work with a small piece on my own pace without anything drying out or getting too out of hand. So now I have my small piece of dough, and I'm going to continue to work this through the machine, bringing it down one length at a time, all the way down to my second to the thinnest setting. Now because there are whole legs in this dough, on that last setting, which is number 1, not the thinnest, 0 is the thinnest, I'm going to actually put it through twice. The proteins from the egg whites will cause this to bounce back, and because we have all those whites in there, if we don't double roll that last round, we'll have a tendency to have too thick of a noodle, a little too much chew. But this is what I like. There's not a right or wrong setting to fill your pasta or your lasagna sheets or whatever it is you're making. This is your kitchen. Some people like really thin and delicate noodles. Some people like those hearty, thick, chewy noodles. And there's not a wrong way to do it. So kind of experiment, play around. There's nothing wrong with making one little piece, cooking it off, and then deciding if that's too thick or thin, and then making the rest of your pasta now that you know what setting you like. All right, so I have my small sheet of pasta here ready to fill. My filling from the other day on standby, and I'm going to pipe in my raviolis here. And we could really go any size you want, whether it be big or small. It's all just gonna matter on how you fold and shape it. And you can use a cutter, you can cut them out. But for what we're going for here is that classic rectangle ravioli shape. And then now comes our squirt bottle. I always like to spray water up in the air, never directly onto the pasta. And that'll just kind of evenly distribute all of that water down and around over our noodles. And that little bit of water is just gonna kind of create that tackiness that when we fold it over, it has something to seal onto. So we're gonna now fold over our sheet, and we have all of our shapes you can see starting to form. Now using our fingers is the way we're gonna create the seal, but it's really important we're using the sides of our fingers and the sides of our thumbs, not the pads. Our pads are really soft, so if you give it a feel, you'll see that your finger pads and tips are super soft, but the hard part is actually the sides of your fingers. So that's gonna be your best tool here for shaping and creating those strong geometric angles and edges. So starting here on one side, we're gonna go right up against the cheese filling, creating a pocket and pressing. Then on the other side, the same thing, trying to remove as much air as possible, coming in on all sides and using our fingers to hold and shape our dough. And you really want to press here. This is your sealing. This is where you're kind of getting the shape to your pasta. And your dough is going to be pretty forgiving. This is a really great dough recipe for beginners, because you can press really hard and you're not going to mess anything up. So I've got all of my edges. I'm sure that everything is sealed. I like all of my angles. And now it's time to cut in with my cutter. I'm going to use the fluted edge. You can use a straight edge. You can even use a knife. It's all up to you. And we're going to start on one side, pulling off this into our trim basket. I always like to lift up the whole piece just to make sure nothing is stuck underneath. If it is sticky or you're working on a sticky surface, a little bit of dusting of flour will help prevent any of that sticking. I'm going to come across on the top. And then we're going to cut in between each ravioli. And there you have it. We've created all of our raviolis. Now for storage, you have a few options. I like to put these onto a semolina dusted tray with some parchment paper. You can put them on a plate dusted with a little bit of flour. They can live in the refrigerator up to overnight, but just keep in mind, if your cheese is really wet and there's a lot of moisture in your refrigerator, it may start to stick. So the colder you can get these, the quicker you cook them, the better off you're going to be. All right, so I also want to show you how to do this with a rolling pin. It's a little more rustic. You won't get it as thin as you would using a dough sheeter, but with a little practice, you won't even use your pasta sheeter. So I have a large rolling pin here, a little bit of flour, and then rolling out using the weight of your upper body, spinning the dough. And what we're actually going for here is always trying to push from the center out. It's easier if you take the more mass of the dough from the middle and work it out towards the ends than any other way, and that kind of helps control where all of the direction the dough is going. And the goal here is to try to keep everything even, working from the center outwards. And then what else helps too is to kind of press in this spiral motion away from you, cupping your hands and rolling the pin on the inside here. And that actually allows you to do this without pressing too hard, and you're using the natural weight of the pin to stretch the dough. And if you find your dough keeps running away from you, sometimes it helps if you tuck a little bit on the edge of the table, and then you really can start working and stretching from the center out. When you're moving the dough, much like you would pie, picking it up, rotating, setting it down, and working in that same long motion. And then you could always check by holding it up to the light to see how thin your dough is getting, and if you have any areas you need to work on that are a little thicker than the rest. But by following it through, like so, you can end up with a sheet that is as thin as using the pasta roller. Using the full length of the table, and it's almost these figure eight circular motions that really help you stretch the dough out evenly. If you get any bunched up or rough spots, you can just roll right through them. They'll correct themselves. But always trying to bring it back and then focusing on the other side. And then from here, once we have this as thin as we'd like it, or as thin as we can get it, we can move on to filling. So my marinara has been going for about 30 minutes here. I've been stirring it, scraping down the bottom just to make sure nothing's sticking. And I'm looking for that very low and controlled light bubble. Things are getting nice and thick. I've tasted this again for seasoning. I added a little more salt, just so we're building and layering those flavors. If we waited till the end to taste it and add the salt, things might end up tasting salty instead of well seasoned. Now that this has been going for about 30 minutes, I'm going to also add my basil, just a handful, stirring in all of these leaves. I don't like to add my herbs at the beginning, so I feel like you cook out the flavor of fresh herbs versus adding them towards the end and then letting that carryover heat really just infuse all the tomatoes and the oil with that fresh basil. All right, everything is ready to cook. I have my marinara on standby. My pasta's ready to go. I have my saucepan, a ladle, and of course my pasta water. I put this on to boil, but I have not seasoned it yet. I always like to wait to season my pasta water until right before I'm about to use it. I don't like it to get over seasoned or risk the water reducing. But now right before it's about to come to a boil, so I'm gonna add my salt. And you just want this well seasoned. There's no need for it to be salty like the sea. It'll be way too salty. And then I have my pasta here. We're going to drop down into the water. And the key here is to get these all in the water as quickly as possible. That way they all cook evenly. But you don't want to dump all the semolina into the water. Things will get a little too crazy and starchy in there. But you can reuse the semolina. If it looks clean, if it's still dry, if it hasn't pulled up too much moisture from the refrigerator or wherever you're storing your pasta, this is good to reuse. So my pasta's cooking. I'm waiting for it to float up to the top. Once it floats, because it's fresh pasta, it'll only probably need 1 or 2 more minutes to finish cooking. You always take one out, take a bite, test it. You want it to be al dente. We're gonna cook it about 90% in the water, the less 10% in the pan. And then I'm gonna take my marinara here. All my basil has wilted down. The onions and garlic have completely melted. And I'm just gonna give it a stir, so that way all that oil that was floating at the top gets emulsified into the tomato and I get an even bit. I'm not getting all tomato or all oil. I'm gonna ladle this into my pan. I'm gonna be cooking my raviolis in because we're gonna marry the two together as one. All right, so my raviolis have been boiling here for about 2 minutes. Once they floated, now it's time to come in here with a spider. I like to skim out the pasta because they are delicate, rather than try to dump this into a colander. You can use a hand strainer as well. We're pulling out the noodles into the tomato, and I like grabbing a little bit of that starchy water to just kind of help emulsify everything as we bring this together. All right, so my raviolis are back in the tomato sauce, and now this is where we're finishing the dish, bringing together that rich red sauce or marinara together with the raviolis. Just cooking that all together. That starchy water and the starches from the pasta are gonna help emulsify all of that oil that we had in the pan, make a rich, creamy sauce. Doing this over high heat, so it is boiling, bubbling. I'm kind of just watching all my noodles, making sure nobody's getting hammered in the pan. You don't obviously want to do this in too small of a pan. Give yourself enough room to work with. All right, our marinara and raviolis have come together as one. And I like to just plate this in one big platter. That's how we do it in my family. One platter, multiple forks or spoons, and everybody gets to share. I've already tasted this for seasoning. I like where I'm at on the salt. A little bit of that salty pasta water helps bring this all together. And now, last but not least, we always eat with our eyes first. I like to save a little bit of whatever herbs I was using in the dish and get some fresh garnish on top. Those will kind of melt down into the pasta. And I have some of my coarsely grated Parmigiano cheese. I just like to sprinkle that on top. One of my favorite things, ravioli and red sauce. And now the moment I've been waiting for, the taste test. One of my favorite things, ricotta ravioli. You can kind of cut each one in half. We made these extra large, so that way you get, at least 2 bites out of each one. And you can see your cheese filling when you kind of squeeze it out. You did it right. I'm at a loss of words. Basil, tomato, playing off that sweet, rich, creamy ricotta filling. The whole eggs in our pasta dough give this a really nice kind of chew, al dente texture, kind of play off that creaminess of the cheese. And like I said, it seems like a lot of oil, but it's not at all. Kind of, you need that to play off that sweetness and the acidity that comes from all those juicy tomatoes. And then a little bit of Parmesan cheese on top brings a little bit of saltiness, nuttiness, kind of round out the whole dish. I don't know about you, I might be able to eat this whole plate.